And now this is the next phase of the detailed history of the Federal Reserve note, the fifth stage. And in this case, although we have 6 subphases, it's really proper to call this one phase. In fact, it is in many respects probably the dullest phase of them all, at least for quite a while. Because what happens here is we're looking at the post-World War II era, and the United States is won. Soldiers have all come back. The GI Bill is helping lots of these folks get an education and move up into good jobs. Many of them learned good skills while in the military on the war. And it was a time of prosperity, the late 1940s, all through the 1950s, and into the 1960s. But we had various changes of the officers of the Treasury, and frankly, that's really about all we have happening here. The more important stuff might be what's going on in the background. So let's just kind of carry over. From before. Now this is where the last series left off with Clarke and Snyder for the 1934 series. And now for the 1950 series, we start off with Clarke and Snyder. And you can see there's some few differences. Now, one difference, there's some stylistic differences. This big blurb up here, alright, has this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Well, that's still there. And the text says the same thing, but it's a lot smaller. Now, the particular identification of the bank, which has been in this circular thing, originally surrounded by some kind of decorative stuff, and then followed up by just this plain circle, is now shrunk and put in this small spiky circle. But other than that, it's just, now you see, Federal Reserve Bank of, in this case, San Francisco, California, and on each side, a little decorative thing where there had been dots before they took away the of the Federal Reserve Bank of wherever. So, on the other side, we have Washington, D.C. has moved from down there to up there. The seal is a bit smaller, as is the word 5. You can see all of that is simply shrunk, but it has retained its appearance in all other respects. And looking at the other side, it's about the same story, maybe even less than that. In fact, I'm not so sure there's any differences at all on this side. So, anyway, so nothing much has changed. So little has changed. There's really not much to say as I just kind of go through these quickly. Because here we are. So here's our series 1950, Clarke and Snyder, front and back. Alright, the next one. So Clarke and Snyder. Now, the signatures would often change sometimes when one officer either gets replaced because, whoever appointed that, the president who appointed him, changes their mind. Other times the person may deliberately leave or retire, or different things may happen. But that's usually one at a time, one side or the other. However, when you have an administration change, they both change simultaneously. And that becomes a far more common phenomena already in the 1950s. Eisenhower becomes president and replaces both Clarke and Snyder with Priest and Humphry. And that's all that changes. Priest and Humphry, and now we're already up on 1950A. So So is there anything else going on at this time? Well, you notice the denominations extend from $5 to $100. So the smaller denominations have never, as you've seen, have never existed as a Federal Reserve note. Now, there are, of course, the old large size Federal Reserve bank notes, which do include $1 and $2, but those are the Federal Reserve bank notes, and as such, that's not a Federal Reserve itself. It's another product of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has, up to this point itself, never descended below $5 in as a denomination. Now, we did go. Okay, now we're going to see here Priest and Humphry. Humphry is replaced for whatever reason later on in Eisenhower's administration. So now we have Priest and Anderson. So, okay, no regime change, just a change from one Secretary of the Treasury to another, while we keep the same treasurer. Other than that, nothing else has changed. Nothing. So, as I said, this is probably going to be about the dullest phase of Federal Reserve notes, at least within itself. Now, there's a few other things going on outside the context of this. Since there are no ones and twos, $1 and $2, you see, those denominations have to be handled by other kinds of money. The $1 is handled by the silver certificates, and the $2 by the United States notes. Although silver certificates also exist as $5 and $10, while at the same time the silver certificate, the United States notes, simply exists as $5. Now we move to the next one, 1950C, and now both signatures have changed because we have transferred over from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration. So now we have Elizabeth Rudel Smith and C. Douglas Dillon. So they are appointed by Kennedy, President Kennedy. So this is the Kennedy era, Camelot and all that. All right, 1950C. So, but other than that, the notes themselves don't change. Now, that was the one thing. Now, the only other thing that happens is the last two phases of this overlap with what turns out to be the next stage of the Federal Reserve note, as it introduces another manufacturing technique, which, because of its difference, even forced a number of small design changes that weren't really relevant, but just necessary because a different printing technique made it inevitable. So in this phase, see, now we still have C. Douglas Dillon, but Catherine O. Hay Granahan. So only one signature change. That indicates that this comes somewhat later, whether by Kennedy himself or maybe Johnson. Okay, but in terms of the bill itself, now we've incremented it to Series 1950D. Nothing else has changed. But as I say, this 1950D will overlap with the first part of the next series, which is 1963. And the second row, or column here, of the 1950E, that's pretty far up as a letter. Only some United States notes from 1928 get further up into F and G, as the 1928s all the way up until the Eisenhower administration. Now these final phase of this in Federal Reserve Note series, which is the 1950E, not only overlaps the 1963A era, but also, since this was already winding down, this only comes from three banks. The New York, as you see here, and Chicago, as we saw there, and the San Francisco, as we see there. So no other banks are doing this last phase. So already this is being phased out, but it did continue, and in all denominations. So we'll continue what happens next with the Federal Reserve notes when we get to the 1963 series, which, as you can see, okay, still has, well, let's compare against this one here because these were actually in the same period. You see the same signatures as 1950D, so the same era, but numerous changes we'll talk about in more detail in the next installment. And maybe and these details affect something on the reverse as well. So that's what will happen, and that's what we'll cover in the next phase. And this is, as I said, probably the dullest phase of Federal Reserve notes. Thanks for listening.